I feel like the climate crisis has been confronting my own life almost every day, every year of my life. The Philippines has had the highest number of extreme weather events in the past 20 years, and I'm 24, which means I was basically born into the climate crisis. I remember being afraid of drowning in my own bedroom growing up as I saw floods consume communities around me and as I saw storm surges destroy people's homes. It was always the super typhoons that got me so afraid of the climate crisis. I remember in 2009, there were two strong super typhoons that left us without electricity for what felt like weeks. And we would have candlelit dinners with as a family, which sounds so romantic, but it was because there was no electricity and the winds were howling outside, and we were so afraid of a tree falling on our house, of an electrical pole falling on our house, of the floods consuming our homes. We were just gathered together as a family, listening to the battery-powered radio, trying to hear if it was time for us to evacuate. And it was also in 2009, actually, that world leaders promised climate finance to global South countries of 100 billion US dollars per year, but until now that still hasn't happened. When we talk about the climate crisis, people sometimes think it's just the extreme weather event. It's just that one super typhoon or the different super typhoons, but it's always about what happens after as well. So often we're not able to adapt. We're not able to bounce back. A very concrete example is how in 2013 with Typhoon Haiyan, after the devastation of the communities, years after, the communities that were impacted are still not recovered. And a lot of young girls and women were forced into prostitution because of the economic devastation that the typhoons brought, which just goes to show that the climate crisis is so intersectional and loops in with the gender crisis and with class inequality. And that's why when we talk about the climate crisis, it has to also talk about these other socioeconomic crises. Growing up seeing the climate crisis when the climate justice movement started to become more mainstream, I noticed something immediately wrong with a lot of the messaging where people were afraid of what was happening in the future. But for me, and for a lot of us in the global South and in the Philippines, we were afraid of what was happening in the present. And so that has always been something that has shaped the way I talk about the climate crisis and has influenced my activism. I've always been so adamant about how it's not a problem of the future. It's not something that we're afraid of happening 10 years from now. It's already happening today, especially to the marginalized people. And that's how it also influences my activism, because there's a strong focus on the people who are most marginalized, on our farmers and our fisher folk and our indigenous peoples, on the working class, on the urban poor, on the people of color. And that's something that we have to make sure that we remember, because to ignore the fact that the climate crisis is already here and already impacting millions is to ignore the voices of the people most marginalized. I wish more people would talk about the joys of activism and the solutions, and how the solutions are about the joys and the love and the fun. Of course, it's so important to talk about all the serious demands, but it's also important to show that there is joy in what we're fighting for, that it isn't scary to be an activist. It isn't all doom and gloom, and there is a lot of hope, not to hide what's happening, not to hide the injustices, but because our optimism is revolutionary, because we are holding on to that gentle future, that safe future, that world where we know that no one will be left behind. If there's one thing that I want people to take away from my story or from my activism, is that to me, activism is an act of love. I feel angry and sad and afraid, and those fuel my activism. But those emotions are coming from a place of love for life and, majority of people and the planet, and for joy and for gentleness. That's what my activism is about. It's not just anti-capitalism or anti-fossil fuel industries. It's also pro-community and pro-joy and pro-justice and pro-innovation. And that's what we should really remember, that when we say that we are unstoppable, another world is possible, we should be building and reimagining what that world looks like already. Let's not box ourselves into these cages where we feel like There's no other chance and there's no other system outside the one that we're currently in. It's something that we have to imagine and create and build together.